Hello and welcome to The Telescope. Every week we bring you a fresh insight from the biggest car market of the world. Today's car is the NIO ET5, the very latest chapter in NIO's production car journey. We have covered the ES8 on this channel before. If you haven't watched that review, click the link in the top right hand corner of the screen to have a look, because the ET5 still shares many of the basic concepts with the ES8. NIO's first electric saloon, the ET7 delivery, started on March the 22nd. That is a 5.1 meter executive saloon going up against the Audi A6, Mercedes E-Class and the BMW 5 Series. But we all knew the volume seller is going to be this, the ET5, a medium-sized saloon, sporty, dynamic, relatively lower priced at $46,000 US. I wrote the press release of this car, went on a test session with the vehicle engineering team, did a static design workshop and the national media test drive, so you will be well informed. The biggest selling feature of the ET5 or any other NIO cars was, is and always will be the battery swap. It makes such a difference to how people use electric vehicles. To me, there are two kinds of electric vehicles, the ones that can battery swap and the ones that cannot. Personally, I still refuse to charge on the highway. The infrastructure, even in China, is just not ready. There are too many factors out of your control. Is there a charger installed? Is it reliable? Is it fast? And most importantly, is there a queue? Because a queue in a charging station is different than the petrol station. A charge on the highway is half an hour at minimum. Meanwhile, battery swap is fast, fully automatic, and as the major selling feature, you can be sure NIO will inspect and maintain the facilities to a much higher standard than the public chargers. The ET5 is the cheapest car that can battery swap, and of course is compatible with all of the batteries released by NIO so far. By purchasing this car, you have access to one of the most impressive EV infrastructure networks in the world. If you think all of this is irrelevant to the international audience, well, NIO has built a factory in Hungary to produce battery swap stations for Europe, and the first few stations has already popped up in Norway, Denmark, Germany and the Netherlands. You know what? I probably need to do a dedicated video on battery swap one day. This is the ET5 review after all, but you get the idea. I really cannot oversell this feature enough. Hey, I'll move on to the car. Promise, I'll move on. To some degree, the ET5 is a car that sells on its design. It's sharp, dynamic, athletic, muscular, in many ways very different to all of the NIO products before. Previously, they're all smooth lines and elegant proportions, but for the entry-level saloon, NIO decided to be more aggressive, and the designers really delivered. At the front, they really dropped the bonnet line, which gave the front passengers excellent forward visibility. This also has an interesting side effect. We'll come to that later. The A-pillar is so swept back. On the positive side, it does make the car look very sporty. On the negative though, it also eats into the headspace somewhat. The wheelbase is as long as it can be for a 4.8 meter long car. At 2,888 millimeters, it offers a touch more space than the Tesla Model 3. This press car is equipped with the optional 20-inch wheels and Pirelli P0 tires, a slight hint into the dynamic capabilities of the ET5. The rear end of the ET5 is arguably the best looking part of this car. Because this car has a fairly short rear end, the aero team really got their work cut out on reducing the wake effect of this car, because usually the longer the rear end is, the easier it is to reduce drag. The spoiler and the diffuser on the ET5 are all functional and produce real downforce. They have to be, otherwise the lift on the rear end would have been quite atrocious. It's just very fortunate that they managed to make these functional elements so good looking. This is my personal Jaguar F-Type, which I still think has the best looking rear end in any production car. But the ET5 is not too far off, and you can almost see the similarities. These two sharp lines dramatically shrinks the volume on the rear end and bring the visual focal point upwards. The boot is made of composite materials because shapes this complex is just too much for metal stamping and pressing. So yeah, a lot of people are sold on the ET5 at first sight. The interior of the ET5 is more in line with the rest of the NIO lineup. The screens are all from the ET7. The backlight of the instrument display is mini LED, right up there with the cutting-edge MacBook Pros, and can sustain 1000 nits full screen brightness. It's also the reason why it doesn't have a cover. It's bright enough all by itself. The main display is a portrait orientation Super AMOLED screen, very high resolution and powered by Qualcomm 8155 chip, responsive as well. The user interface is highly polished and very customizable. On materials, you can spec this car to be leather-free. The center console and the window switches are all made of recycled composite materials. Each ET5 contains about 100 standard PET plastic bottles. The overall feel of the cabin still feels luxurious and upmarket despite not using any fancy materials. In terms of fit and finish, it's the usual NIO standard. The center console especially reminds me of my ThinkPad. Nobody ever thought them of being cheap. I said in the beginning that I did the national media test drive of the ET5, and widely shared criticism is that the seating position, especially the front row, is too high. It feels like you're sitting on top of the car. Here is the full story. Firstly, it's the battery swap. To be compatible with that system, which let's not forget, first showed up on the ES8. That is a 5-meter SUV, and this is a relatively compact saloon. To fit that battery pack into the ET5, something has to give. I think, and this is purely my personal opinion, to sit 5 centimeters taller and get battery swap is a complete no-brainer. The benefit far outweighs the sacrifice because it's the battery swap. It fundamentally changes the way... Okay, I'll stop. Secondly, the seating position is exaggerated by the low front bonnet line, because the truth is the ET7 is just as tall as the ET5 and nobody complained. The engineers of the ET5 pushed really hard to lower the cowl point, the point where the A-pillar and the bonnet connects. So yes, I'm willing to sit a few centimeters taller in exchange for battery swap. If you disagree because you have not seen the battery swap in action, I completely understand. But when you have, I think you will agree with me. In terms of space, I'm 5'11" and I can sit in the back of my driving position. It's definitely not as big as the ET7 or any of the China-only extended wheelbase A4, C-Class and the 3 Series. And it's not meant to be. At 4.79 meters, the ET5 is a mid-size saloon more focused on the dynamic capabilities, and none of the German rivals can match the acceleration of this car at this price point. The real effort of this car's interior is spent on the ambient lighting. It is a much more dramatic effect than any of the previous models. The product definition guy, yes, this guy, says he wants to give the users a car that is relaxing most of the time but can be turned up at any moment. Now we're on the move. The ET5, like every other NIO model, has 2-motor, 490 horsepower, 0 to 100 acceleration is done in 4 seconds. Claimed. In reality, this is a 3.7 to 3.8 seconds car, so the performance, as usual, is more than enough. The chassis setup of the ET5 is, I think, where it differentiates the most from all of its predecessors. Yes, all of the NIO models has a lot of performance, but you never want to drive them that fast. They are all very softly sprung, laid-back, comfort-biased setup, which I suppose is appropriate for a massive SUV like the ES8 or an executive saloon like the ET7. But the ET5, luckily, however, is not any of that. It's tight, compact, full of road information. Body control is excellent to the point that I think it's even confidence-inspiring. That is that I have never associated with any NIO cars before. It just encourages you to drive harder and harder. Meanwhile, the ride quality is nowhere near as punishing as the Tesla Model 3. This still is a very refined luxury saloon. Another point I find similar to my F-Type is that I feel great sitting here knowing how good it must look from the outside. It's a great looking car. It's not just the pleasure of driving it, it's also the pleasure you give to others. The F-Type can do that, it's kind of expected, but on a regular family saloon, I never expected that. In terms of range and efficiency, the ET5 is NIO's most efficient car. That is also understandable because it's also the smallest. On the 100 kWh battery, the ET5 is rated at 710 km CLTC. When you translate that to WLTP, it's roughly 580 km. In EPA terms, that's roughly 320 miles. On the base model, you get 560 km CLTC. That's roughly 420 km WLTP. But for NIO cars that can battery swap, range numbers is actually not that relevant. Let's put that in a dedicated battery swap video because this review is getting too long. So it seems up until this point, this is a glowing review for the ET5, and rightly so. I really do think it's a cracking car. But here's my dislikes. First dislike is the steering. It's too slow for a sporty saloon that can do 0 to 100 within 4 seconds, especially the on-center response. If you put light steering input, the nose barely has any response. I know on the plus side, this kind of setup improves high-speed stability, but it just makes this otherwise very dynamic car feels a bit numb when you're changing lanes on the highway. Second dislike is the rear visibility. It's so poor to the point that I would not even compare this to any of the regular cars. Put it into context, the rear visibility of the ET5 is even worse than the Jaguar F-Type, which is a two-seater sports car. Third dislike is slightly less relevant. This is a rear-biased car. Most of the time, it's only the rear motor pushing the car forward. However, most of the time, you cannot feel that. This is a very safe kind of four-wheel drive balance, and that is a shame. As I said before, this car is very dynamic if you drive within 7/10 of the car's capabilities. Once you go beyond that and you arrive at the limit and expecting some fun from the rear axle, it doesn't have that. But I suppose not that many people will experience this in daily driving. However, as a 490 horsepower car, I think you should be informed. There are many aspects of the ET5 that I have not even touched on. For example, this particular car has a beta version of the latest autonomous driving software. I cannot tell you what it is because it's not released yet. There's also the augmented reality glass, the Dolby Atmos sound system, the NIO phone app that has been copied by so many others. You get the idea. Even if you strip all those features away and treat the ET5 as a normal car, it is still a very compelling proposition. NIO's co-founder Qin Lihong said in the Chengdu Auto Show that the target is to outsell the BMW 3 Series in China. To be honest, when we decided to say that, we were expecting a fair bit of public backlash, saying that we were too ambitious, that will never happen, how dare you even compare yourself to the likes of BMW. However, the response after the event was like, yeah, that was about right. So it turned out we were not bold enough with the statement. That gives you an idea about the public expectation on the ET5. Hopefully, this will open the floodgates for NIO and the ET5 will head to Europe. So yeah, see you there next year.